Well, good afternoon, everyone. And Gerald, thank you so much for the opportunity, to the Friends of the East-West Center, to Rick Hornick, to my many colleagues, friends, and associates in Honolulu or wherever you're joining from. I will tell you, I'm joining you from Washington, D.C. today, where it's a cool, rainy fall day. And so for those of you, particularly in Hawaii, I'm very envious and wish frankly, I was there rather than in Washington this afternoon. But I'm delighted to join you and address some comments initially on the Quad and strategic competition with China. And as Gerald quite rightly put it, we are at an extraordinary moment to consider the Quad, to consider strategic competition, indeed to consider U.S. Indo-Pacific relations and international affairs more generally. As you well know, the Trump administration has just passed its 7th day as president-elect and about to take office here in January, in the 3rd week of January. So as nominees come forward, we have an opportunity to think about what that means for U.S. relations with the Indo-Pacific, including specifically the Quad initiative. But I would suggest, since we are talking about 4 members of the Quad, that we should also consider what's going on in other Quad countries. So in Japan this past week, as you know, a new minority government has been formed under former Defense Minister Shigeru Ishiba, and that is a very unusual situation for Japan to have a minority-led government in which the LDP suffered considerably in the last elections. And so that's a somewhat less certain situation than we have been accustomed to in the Quad partnership with Japan during the previous prime ministership of Mr. Kishida, and of course, prior to Mr. Kishida, Mr. Shinzo Abe. In Australia, we are, of course, should note that current Prime Minister Albanese attended the first leaders meeting of the Quad within literally hours of taking office and being elected as Australia's Prime Minister. But now Australia too, by roughly around May of 2025, since it's a parliamentary system, will go to the polls. And while there's no major dramatic changes, of course, in Australia's commitment to the Quad, having just participated in the Delaware summit with the other countries, it is notable that there are elections around the corner, and we should be watchful of what that might mean as well. And then finally, in India, again, no dramatic changes. We have the return of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his very well-known foreign minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, in office. But the Prime Minister Modi government does return with a much reduced majority in the Lok Sabha, or the People's House, the lower house of the Indian Parliament. And while there are no doubts whatsoever about India's official commitment to the Quad, I would just note that there is a context there too to consider. All this being said, it just reiterates how important the timing is to consider both the Quad's future and strategic competition's future, and the two of them together. All the countries since the US elections have made statements in one way or another indicating their commitment to the Quad going forward. And India, in fact, which was scheduled to host the Quad leaders meeting in 2024, has agreed to host the Quad meeting in 2025 because, as you well know, about a month ago, President Biden hosted the Quad in his home state of Delaware. So let me make some comments because I was told to speak for about 15-20 minutes max, lay out a framework, and then put some things on the table which I hope will generate questions, comments, criticisms as we go forward. First, the obvious question for a panel or a program entitled The Quad and U.S.-China Strategic Competition is, if this is the state of affairs in the 4 Quad countries politically, what is the state of strategic competition? As we have written in our recent assessment, not only of the Quad report, but also in our new report, Navigating Uncertainty and Continuity in the context of the 2024 US elections on Asia policy, strategic competition, we believe, is here to stay. In fact, on all fronts, there are various measures that suggest there is a hardening of US-China strategic competition. And with the election of the Trump administration, I anticipate no major changes. Indeed, the initial nominees to hold key posts, whether that be the UN ambassador post, the Secretary of State post, the National Security Advisor post, and indeed the Secretary of Defense post, all suggest that a very hard line with China is in the offing, given previous statements and previous positions, votes, legislation, depending on the person involved. And so I think that there is no likelihood of a significant change in strategic competition with China. Having said that, I would also further reiterate this assessment because it's not just the executive branch or key national security departments and agencies that have hardened on strategic competition with China, but also the United States Congress. I would point out, for example, that an entire week was devoted, so-called China Week, to looking at legislation, regulations, actions that spoke to the issue of US-China strategic competition. And given, as many of you know, how the US Congress operates, a whole week given to an issue related to relations with one country is a very significant sign of the seriousness and the care and the commitment to prosecuting the relationship with China. And finally, I would note that there is significant American public support for a hardening of strategic competition with China. Most public opinion polls show a significant drop in support for China. In fact, our new East-West Center poll of elites and publics on the importance of Asia also suggests significant concerns with China. And I hope you'll take a look at that report as well. And then finally, again, because we're talking about the Quad, I would note that in India, Japan, and Australia, too, the position about strategic competition with China, if not framed in precisely the same way, remains very much salient. And so Australia, Canberra, Tokyo, Japan, and New Delhi have all, in one way or another, taken actions to harden their positions in terms of strategic competition with China. I would also note that, like the United States, they have also maintained lines of communication, lines of normal diplomatic engagement, and in fact, sought particular areas of cooperation with China as well, including in the trade and investment in particular, most notably with recent relaxations by the Indian government on investment and trade with China, as both countries negotiate a climb down from their border disputes and territorial disputes in the Northeast. So that's my comments on strategic competition. Let me turn to what I consider to be the key variables that will determine whether the Quad can contribute to strategic competition. And I would identify 5 areas which would be important to assess as we go forward and learn more about the Trump administration and the other government's commitment to the Quad, to see whether or not the Quad will have indeed a role in this strategic competition. The first of these variables is securitization. And what I mean by that is the Quad thus far has not been heavily framed as a security organization. Indeed, over the history of the Quad since it was formed in 2004 in response to a terrible Christmas tsunami and earthquake as a humanitarian relief and disaster relief mission, securitization has grown very, very slowly in terms of strategy and defense. In fact, many of the activities of the Quad for the first 2 decades were around non-traditional issues, but I'll get to that in a moment. So the first issue is, will the Quad have an explicit, overt focus on being a security organization? I would say right now, the evidence suggests that it is paying more attention to security and strategy, and in fact, defense and other elements of security cooperation. But that is not the Quad's focus thus far, and there is considerable resistance amongst Quad members to make this organization overtly and entirely security focused. The second variable is institutionalization. Now, institutionalization is a fancy word for saying creating an organization that can carry out regular, routine, ongoing, and sustainable tasks in support of strategic competition. Currently, there is no such institutionalization of the Quad, though since 2017, with 6 leader-level visits, foreign ministers, leader level, and other visits and meetings, there is a kind of de facto institutionalization because officials, staff, bureaucrats on all 4 sides are regularly keeping a pace to support their leaders' meetings and the work that goes into them. However, my judgment is that institutionalization is not in the immediate offing for a variety of reasons, not least because the agenda of the Quad continues to dissipate and become diffuse, and it is very hard increasingly to have a central locus of the Quad's activities. And certainly that is not likely to be placed in the respective defense departments as a new organization working on security issues and strategic competition. The third issue is operationalization. And by that, I mean that this would suggest that the Quad would begin implementing a wide series of defense and security activities to support strategic competition with China. While there are clearly elements, particularly in the maritime domain, logistics, Coast Guard cooperation, and others, which I will speak about momentarily, there is, in my view, still a focus on a public goods agenda of the Quad, which is extremely wide-ranging, ranging from health issues, disaster relief, infrastructure support, access to financing, sustainable development, et cetera, et cetera. So I do not see in the operationalization variable overall commitment to securitization of the Quad. A fourth variable is the integration of the Quad members. As I have kind of alluded to, the Quad members have generally, for a very long time, in fact, during Quad meetings, used to issue separate press releases or statements about Quad meetings. More recently, there has been an integration of the messaging and of the statements where all 4 parties sign. But there are a diffuse range of priorities for each country in the Quad, and those are also reflected in those statements. And so they range from issues related to the civil war in Myanmar to a range of other issues. And so while clearly steps at integration and 4-party collaboration are going to go on, and I'll list a few towards a little bit later, so far, in my judgment, the 4 militaries are not integrating in a way that would suggest that the Quad has a direct role in strategic competition with China. The final variable I would suggest we look at is potential coordination and alignment with other alliances and minilaterals. I have argued in a recent paper that U.S. multilateral policy in the Indo-Pacific is moving from wheels, which is the hub and spokes alliance system model, to webs, which was particularly popular in the 1990s and the 2000s, to a much more what I call wired multilateralism, which are small groups of wired or connected partners. And you can see this on everything from supply chain resilience to critical minerals to semiconductor agreements to such more well-known organizations or efforts, I should say, as the US-Japan ROK Trilateral Agreement, the Australia-UK-US or so-called AUKUS arrangement, and more recently, the US-Japan-Philippines Trilateral, sometimes referred to in newspapers as the Squad. So we see a number of wired kind of configurations which are like-minded, and particularly important, these last three, because unlike the Quad, the US-Japan ROK Trilateral, AUKUS, and the US-Japan-Philippines all involve only allies. And one issue that is very important to remember about the Quad is it has three allied countries, but they are not allied with each other, meaning India has no alliances with any of the other three, and the other countries such as Australia and Japan, for example, while very constructive, productive, and close partners, are not treaty allies. So with those variables in mind, let me turn to the promise of the Quad before concluding with a few thoughts on some of the challenges or some of the limitations. The promise of the Quad is so obvious in its formation of bringing three allies along with a partner such as India, which has increasing weight economically, diplomatically, and militarily in the region. But for the reasons I precisely noted, India is not and is not likely to be an allied country with any of these three countries. And that will put natural inhibitions or constraints on the Quad working together as a defense organization, despite Chinese statements that it constituted a kind of Asian NATO. As you well know, Chinese comments on the Quad have ranged from dismissive, it's sea foam that will soon disappear, to much more derogatory, such as an attempt at encirclement or containment of China, to other assessments such as the fact that it is an Asian NATO. The second element of the promise of the Quad is that historically, since 2004, when the Quad essentially came to be on an ad hoc basis, China has not been the driver, not been a major consideration. And in fact, disagreements about China have ended up derailing or undermining coherence in the Quad, which led it to essentially de facto disband in 2007 until it was revived in 2017 under the first Trump administration. But as you can tell, now concerns about China, as I stated at the outset, have become very common amongst the four countries. And barring any major dramatic changes, concerns about China's assertiveness, aggressive behavior, coercion, and Chinese threats to the national interests of the four Quad countries will continue to, in my judgment or assessment, be at work in a much more common way than they have been over the preceding 20 years. So this is part of the promise of the Quad as having a role in strategic competition with China. The final thing I'll say about the Quad in terms of promise is its move from, as I said, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, COVID-19 vaccinations, climate change, critical and emerging technologies, space, education, and cybersecurity, to more recently, a focus on deeper strategic alignment. And just to flag three elements that were in the Delaware statement of the Quad meeting, for example, the ongoing Malabar exercises among US, Japan, Australia, and India, the Quad at Sea Ship Observer Mission that was announced and will start in 2025 with exchanges amongst the four countries on Coast Guard, and the Quad Indo-Pacific Logistic Network, which aims to create more interoperability and logistics between the four countries with the intent of supporting civilian response to natural disasters. So in all of these ways, you can see there are elements or steps taken to integrating Quad members, which would have elements of defense and security relevance. What are some of the constraints? And I'll close with these. First, strategic competition with China was not the original driver of Quad. And as I mentioned, disputes over strategic competition with China disrupted Quad. Now, while I've made the case that I do not believe that is likely to be the case in the coming years because of the consensus around strategic competition in the US and in the four countries, I have to at least allow for the possibility that things could change, as they do in international affairs. People sometimes speak about a possible deal with China under a second Trump administration. Is that possible? I do not know. What I simply suggest is that we cannot absolutely predict that the trend line on China will continue in the same, even though I expect that more likely than not, strategic competition will continue. The second, it is difficult to imagine that the Quad can anytime soon replace or even surpass the level of assistance, trade, and investment that partnership with China provides for many Indo-Pacific countries, particularly smaller ones that have less close relations with US, Japan, Australia, and India. So my simple statement here is that while the Quad is an important aspect of providing public goods in the region, its agenda is so huge and diffuse, and its delivery not always optimal. And China will, under all probable scenarios, even with a slowing economy, will remain a significant trade, investment, and other forms of assistance partner with many, many countries across the Indo-Pacific region. And the Quad is not likely to supplant that either together or in any single case of a Quad member country. To take one example, infrastructure assistance. Two experts at the Hudson Institute note that the Quad Debt Management Resource Portal, and I'm quoting, aims to provide access to bilateral and multilateral capacity building across the vast region. But it is a poor response to Asia's Infrastructure Investment Bank, which has a capitalization of $100 billion. So my bottom line on the constraints is that the public goods element is excellent, but will not replace China. There is a possibility that China may not be the unifying force for strategic competition that it is and is likely to be for the coming years. So we will have to wait. And finally, the Quad will have to compete with a number of other vehicles to prosecute strategic competition, including alliances and the other minilaterals that I had mentioned. So with that, let me stop and welcome comments, discussion, questions, and pushback. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Satu. That was really a terrific tour of the horizon, if you will. One thing that you mentioned China's public statements vis-a-vis the Quad, but what's your impression of how it really views the Quad? If that's even possible to explore.
Yeah, we have had discussions with academics from China and think tank experts from China. I myself have participated in some of these discussions. I will tell you that I think that they think the Quad is here to stay. Mm-hmm. That I think no amount of Chinese criticism is going to I do not believe anyone in China thinks calling it an Asia NATO or a containment strategy or sea foam that will dissipate will shape the direction of Quad. So that's point one, which is not said, that it's not going away. The second is that it is very hard to appreciate or understand, as one person put it in a recent conference we were together in Manila, that the Quad in some sense is made in Beijing, as in part revived because of concerns about China. And so while the Chinese, that's the second thing I'd say, is that China doesn't appear to appreciate that part of what's holding the Quad together, which may or may not have held together earlier, is because of perceptions of Chinese aggression and assertiveness. So those are the two examples I would suggest that are unsaid, but probably somewhere in the system in China.
Denny Roy would like to ask if you could itemize how each of the governments fall on the range of wanting to securitize, to increase securitization of the Quad. So, India, Japan, Australia.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a difficult one because, as you can imagine, within each of the governments, including our own here in the United States, there are differences of views, and there are certainly different views between ministries and departments. I would say that there tends to be, from what I hear, more interest in the United States than any place else about securitization or strategic competition, and Quad as being a part of it. I see much less receptivity to this, and then Japan, followed by Japan. And then in the third category, in the third priority order that Denny asked, I would put Australia, and the fourth, I would put India. And it's interesting because, quite frankly, if you reprioritize those four in terms of how strategic competition focused they want the Quad to be, India and Japan have had the most direct conflictual relations with China, both on the land borders and for the Japanese on the East China Sea and Senkakus. But I would say that still I would hold a priority in the way I gave it.
Mm-hmm. By the way, we're open for questions now. We do it through the chat function, so please send them in. Talking about China and India, as you mentioned, the relations seem to be thawing a little bit, or who knows exactly what's happening with what's driving the Modi-Xi relationship at any one time. But is that having any impact on the internal dynamics of the Quad? Might that sort of be open some daylight, if you will, between India?
Let me make sure. Yeah, let me make sure I understand, Rick, that you're suggesting that perhaps due to the recent, well, let's call it rapprochement or climb down off the worst parts of the conflict between India and China, that maybe India will be less committed to the Quad. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. My own judgment and assessment is no, that Quad is now separate from the attempts of India and China to move past the past roughly 3 years of very intense border conflict, which led for the first time in 40 odd years to deaths on both sides. So no, I do not think that Prime Minister Modi's government will move away from the Quad. In fact, as the host of the next Quad meeting in 2025, as I said, I think Prime Minister Modi, in fact, will seek to find ways to highlight the Quad, or to think of new roles for the Quad or new initiatives for the Quad in the year that India hosts that meeting. But I do not think, by the same token, if India-China rapprochement doesn't reduce India's commitment to Quad, nor do I think that commitment to Quad will in some way improve India-China relations. I think we're in an age of what we used to call in the US, slowly over the last, let's say, decade, India-China now are locked into a strategic distrust because of the border and other issues. And I don't see that strategic competition just on a bilateral basis fading away anytime soon.
Amanda Ellis asks, recently Samoa hosted the Commonwealth Heads of Government Foreign Policy under Trump 2.0. Will that change Quad dynamics? Oh, sorry.
I
Yeah.
missed the first part of
Yeah,
it.
sorry.
Sorry, that's not the question. Do you want
No,
me
I
to read it out, Rick?
Yeah, I've got it. Recently, Samoa hosted the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, but Prime Minister Modi was instead at the BRICS Plus meeting hosted by Putin. How do you see the BRICS Plus evolving, and what impact might that have on the Quad?
Yeah, again, a terrific question. India is managing to have its foot in multiple multilateral groupings. So it's a member of Quad. It attends the G7 as an observer, but it's also in BRICS. And I myself do see very little correlation between the BRICS track and the Quad track. The Quad track will go on its own. The BRICS track will go on its own. And as you know, Amanda, the BRICS is expanding with more members, including potential new members from the Indo-Pacific region. I may have this wrong, but I believe Malaysia has expressed an interest, but there may be other countries as well. So the BRICS has clearly expanded. So I don't think they'll have any mutual effect. I think India has found it possible to be a member of multiple arrangements and will push that sort of, if you will, non-aligned or multi-aligned or polygamous multilateral policy into the future.
We have a couple of questions that focus on the recent election and what the Carlos Suarez says, asks, in what ways will a more transactional style of U.S. foreign policy under Trump 2.0 change Quad dynamics? Same basic question from Paul Smith.
Yeah, my own sense is the transactional style of U.S. foreign policy, as it's sometimes called, is not likely to affect the Quad as much as it's likely to affect bilateral relationships in the Quad. So one could foresee, for example, bilateral U.S.-Japan discussions regarding the burden sharing of the costs of U.S. forces in Japan, or Japanese commitment to the increase or doubling of defense spending, or the acquisition of particular armaments, or its roles and missions under certain conditions. And you could see that with many countries through the and I'll just restrict myself to the Indo-Pacific region, whether it's the Republic of Korea or Australia or other countries. So I don't think that transactional style will be as important for the Quad. I cannot imagine, anyway, it's not impossible, but cannot imagine the US asking something of the Quad, since it's itself a member of the Quad. So it would be asking itself to do something transactional. But whereas I could imagine certain requirements or asks of the three member countries, India, Japan, and Australia. So that would be my answer. And you had a second question, Rick?
They were sort of combined. Okay. So going back to Amanda's question slightly, how do the neighbors view the Quad? We've talked about how China views the Quad, ASEAN in particular, but the region. What do they see it as something that's impactful or just or not?
Yeah, as you can imagine, it's a big region, lots of countries, 10 members of Southeast Asia, the Pacific Island countries, other countries. Look, the views are decidedly mixed. There's been lots of survey opinions done, lots of qualitative work done on views of the Quad. I think we could say 3 or 4 things with reasonable assurance. Number one, the Quad, in terms of providing public goods, remains under delivery. That is to say, its public goods delivery is suboptimal to the announced agenda for public goods. Mm-hmm. 2, there has been concern expressed, less more recently now that we're roughly 10 more years into the Quad, about it becoming a anti-China or a constraining China factor. for the reasons I've mentioned, that really hasn't happened in the same way. And indeed, other organizations and multilaterals have been much more deliberately and directly focused on prosecuting strategic competition. US, Japan, Korea, the AUKUS arrangement, US, Japan, Philippines, or the so-called Squad, as I mentioned. Those are far more specifically, directly, and deliberatively part of the prosecution of the strategic competition than the Quad has been framed. So I think that's the second thing. The third thing is that my assessment is that most Asian countries, and I've written this, and I'll just say this phrase again, I use it often to describe regional views. Most Asian countries are willing to do a lot to stay on the right side of the United States and to stay off the wrong side of China. And that is a distinction with a difference, meaning they're willing to tolerate AUKUS, willing to tolerate Quad, willing to tolerate US-Japan ROK, willing to tolerate US-Japan Philippines, willing to join, for example, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework in order to stay on the right side of the United States. Why? Not out of love alone or anything like that, but national interests, which are that the United States remains the default demand power for the region, given its importance, size, economy, military, etc. So I think that the Quad is viewed as, if it's a way of keeping the United States engaged, working with its allies and partners to provide regional security and regional public goods, it can be tolerated. And that's how I would see regional perspectives on the Quad today.
So, and you mentioned they, trying to stay on the good side of China as well. Is there any chance, or
off the wrong side of China?
Off the wrong side, sorry. Is there any chance, as you brought this up before? I mean, probably AUKUS. The Quad is partially created because of China. You could argue that what's happened in the South China Sea over the last 10 years has been entirely the creation of China. I remember 10 or 15 years ago, people saying that, if the Chinese had just left things alone, they would have wound up taking over the entire South China Sea sort of peacefully. Is there any chance that China might see the incoming Trump administration as an opportunity to sort of begin to remove some of that motivation? To try to keep make it so that people are less afraid of being on the wrong side of China?
Well, that's a fair question. I certainly don't know. Given that the Trump administration has also indicated its desire or potential willingness to go up to tariffs of up to 60%, perhaps that's a escalate to de-escalate negotiating tactic. Maybe it's just kind of a framework to begin discussions. I do not know. We shall find out. But I would say that right now, there does not seem to me any prospect. I just returned from Manila this weekend. I do not see any prospect of China ratcheting down its forward position or its aggressive position on South China Sea issues, or for that matter, East China Sea issues. So I cannot imagine what would make China reduce those positions under a Trump administration, especially if they're also going to get more pressure on the tariff or the economic side as well. But then again, I raised this issue again, and I would just put it on the table that, deals are possible. I'm always reminded that a deal was made to normalize relations with China in '72. And it is not impossible in the world of international relations to imagine deals, though I think I would find it very surprising indeed under current conditions.
Mm-hmm. Bill Armbruster is asking a question. You may have heard something he said. Anyway, has Marco Rubio expressed any views on the Quad that you know of?
If I'm not mistaken, and someone will have to I'll have to check on this. I'm saying this without the actual factual information to hand. There is a Quad caucus been established in the Congress, and there is legislation to support the Quad. And I simply don't have before me the members that have signed on to either the caucus or the legislation supporting Quad. So that's something I should check. And I don't know whether Senator Rubio, in his position as Senate and Foreign Affairs Committee, has signed on to that or not. Okay.
Just a personal interest. You mentioned Coast Guard cooperation. I'm quite interested in that. Especially how China has militarized its Coast Guard in the South China Sea and other places. I'm curious what that entails on the.
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly will see. The initial announcement, we don't know because no such initiative has actually been implemented yet. But according to the Delaware statement of the Quad meeting, and I would remind myself of the exact name, it's called the Quad at Ship Observer Mission, which will initially, the U.S. Coast Guard will host officers from the Japan Coast Guard, Australian Border Force, and the Indian Coast Guard. Then each country will take turns hosting the others with the aim of improving Coast Guard interoperability. So again, we'll have to see its implementation. We'll have to see how that rolls out and what steps are taken. As you well know, Rick, there is an Asian Heads of Coast Guard meeting. There are Coast Guard activities, either small groups of countries or others. This new Quad at Ship Observer Mission seems to me starting on a very low level of simply observers from each other's Coast Guards, ramping up amongst the Quad countries. Whether that will eventually include other countries, whether it might include maritime surveillance or other types of activities, meaning operational activities, I simply don't know because it's just been announced and not even one actual implementation step has been taken. So we'll see in 25.
And it seems like it's more, to use your distinction, an issue of a public good as opposed to a securitization motivation.
I certainly see that is the step, but as you can imagine, when three allies and a close strategic partner begin to have it's not interoperability, but interpersonnel exchanges through their Coast Guards, which haven't occurred before. That is certainly a new platform and a new baseline for conducting activities amongst their defense and security establishments. So that is what I mean by this very slow trajectory towards laying the baseline and opportunities for more integrated work together amongst the Quad countries. But this is pretty low threshold level in terms of the kind of things that, let's say, if the US, Japan, and ROK as allies sharing the same equipment, same information, protocols, etc., could do, or certainly that US, UK, and Australia could do through the AUKUS mechanism. That's a very different beast, I would say, than what the Quad is proposing under this specific initiative.
Even I believe the U.S. and Vietnam have some Coast Guard cooperation programs.
Oh, sure. And we sell Coast Guard cutters to countries in the region. There's Coast Guard training. There's Coast Guard exchanges. We have, we have a Coast Guard designee, a representative at our embassy in Manila. So, there's lots of those Coast Guard activities, but this is a specific Quad one. And first, let's see what the Quad does together as Coast Guards or equivalent of Coast Guards in the Australian case. And then let's see what they do for the region in terms of public goods delivery on Coast Guard. So if they focus on humanitarian assistance, marine environment, marine surveillance, fishing, IUU fishing activities. So let's just see. I mean, as I said, one of my major criticisms of the Quad is too big an agenda and under delivery.
Danny Roy has done a little research. He says Rubio sponsored a bill in Congress, quote, to treat India on par with U.S. allies such as Japan, Israel, South Korea, and NATO allies in terms of technology transfers and support India's response to increasing threats to its territorial integrity. So
Thanks, Denny. Yeah, I wasn't sure, were you able to discern whether the senator was a member of the Quad Caucus? I thought, I wasn't sure about that, but thank you for that information on the India.
Okay, well, I think we should wrap up now. If you could send us the links to that survey of elites that you mentioned, we can post that. And also the more recent reports that you've done on East Asia, just so
Absolutely.
we can, share it with people here.
Absolutely. Okay, so here is the link, folks, to the Asia Matters for America. This is the second edition. We do it with the University of Chicago's National Opinion Research Center. It's called Elite and Public Opinion on How Asia Matters for America. There's the link to the report. And coming up shortly, here is the link to the report on the 2024 elections and U.S.-Asia strategy. And I'll put that into the link as well.
All right. Well, again, thank you. I'm sorry we haven't had you on sooner. We've tried a couple of times. Anyway, I hope this will become a regular occurrence for the China seminar. It's really been terrific. And now I'm going to throw it over to my colleague, Gerald Cotto, to thank everyone.